Hello everyone, welcome to What's Missing. I'm not much of a YouTuber content creator myself. I just watch a lot of YouTube, a lot of political stuff, crime mystery stuff, history stuff, conspiracy stuff, comedy stuff, entertainment in general. There's a lot of cool content on YouTube. So I thought, this is probably the place where if I have an opinion about something, then why not, dish it out here and see if anybody cares enough to argue back or listen in. So really this is just for my sake, but also just for the sake of conversation. So today, the bill I'm talking about, it's gotten a lot of negative coverage, at least by the right-wing YouTube community, and they all seem to quote the same Tucker Carlson segment that appeared on Fox just a few weeks ago. So I thought, all right, if I want to get to the heart of why people don't like this issue or why they disagree with this bill, then I should probably just look at the Tucker Carlson segment and just check out for myself exactly like whether or not I agree with what he has to say. And maybe through our discussion, we can figure out where the truth lies in what he says, if there is any truth at all. And personally, I'm of the opinion that he does lie a lot in this segment. But we're going to take a look at it in just a second. Let's check it out.
Welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Last night on this show, we told you about what may be the single most extreme and disruptive piece of legislation ever to gain widespread support in the Congress in the history of this country. It's called the New Way Forward Act. It's before Congress right now and has been for almost 2 months. And yet so far, it has been essentially ignored by the country's major media outlets, which are either too embarrassed of it or too ignorant to cover it.
So this video and the article he wrote were both published on February 7th, 2020. And as far as I can tell, he's right. Essentially, almost none of the major news outlets had covered the bill at that time. The important word he used, however, is that beautiful qualifying word, essentially. Essentially, he's not wrong. But if you want to take a look at the links below, plenty of left-wing and independent news groups have covered this bill, including the Huffington Post and the ACLU, which is one of the major organizations that is fighting to pass this bill. So, no, this bill isn't just festering in the dark somewhere. It's being discussed, and just because there isn't a BuzzFeed article about it doesn't mean there won't be. Really, to me, it just seems like Tucker's trying to just scare his audience with the vague threat of a left-wing conspiracy out to destroy America while nobody's looking. Honestly, I think it's pretty insane to equate the destruction of America with this new bill. But we'll get into that in a second. I don't think we've even talked about what's in the bill yet, so we'll keep going. Let's take a look.
That's a disservice to you because it's really impossible to describe just how radical this bill is. If passed, it would remake our immigration system for the express purpose of helping foreign-born criminals live here. The bill would allow people who've committed serious felonies in other countries to move to the United States legally. It would make it nearly impossible for federal immigration officials to detain immigrants, no matter how potentially dangerous they are.
Okay, so Tucker makes a lot of claims here. One of which being that he thinks the New Way Forward Act is intended to help migrant criminals come to the U.S. I don't know where he's getting this information, but from what I read in the bill, this is simply not the case. There's nothing in that bill to even suggest that criminals from other countries are going to be accepted at our border. Nothing. What it does say, however, is that undocumented persons convicted of a crime by the U.S. will be given the option to face a retrial. In Title I, Section 102, the bill explains why these retrials are being offered in the first place. The accused had been convicted of a crime and subsequently deported without facing due process. This means they were convicted without evidence, without witnesses, without resources to prepare for a case, and now they'll have a chance at the fair trial they never had. When Tucker Carlson says, the Democrats are allowing migrants to enter our country, I think he's referring to one of the ways immigration courts would be forced to change under this bill. It states that undocumented persons can no longer be charged of a crime based on past criminal history alone. Now, convicting someone based only on their criminal history, it wouldn't be allowed if it was an American citizen, because our law considers this specific means of reaching a conviction to be a breach of your civil rights. Just because you committed a crime in the past doesn't mean you committed the crime you're being charged with now. Considering all the cases that are going to be retried, and the fact almost every defendant now has a criminal record thanks to a lack of due process the first time around, it'd be impossible to even conduct a fair retrial without changing the way immigration courts make their decisions. In this case, changing what rights undocumented persons have access to. And as a result, yes, more migrants with criminal records are going to be allowed to stay in the US. But the way Tucker puts it, he thinks the Democrats are just going to let migrant criminals invade our country. This is not the case. And all you need to do is take a look at the bill and see for yourself. It's not an easy read, but it's worth your time if you care about this type of stuff.
Perhaps most infuriatingly and remarkably, it would require taxpayers to transport deported criminals back into the United States. In other words, you break our laws, you hurt our people, we'll send you a plane ticket. We'll pay for you to come back. It's utter and total insanity.
So, yes, plane tickets and the taxpayer. Remember a second ago when I was talking about due process and how all of these cases being retried were carried out originally without due process? And it's no small number of cases. Over 500,000 people were deported over the last 2 years. I'm sure all those plane tickets won't be cheap. These are people who were convicted without due process, though. People who now live under the label of criminal despite facing no evidence of their crime, and at times not even being asked what their immigration status was when ICE and local law enforcement conduct their arrests. This exact situation happened to a machine shop worker named Juan Hernandez when ICE performed a raid at his job and arrested him without even asking for ID. Luckily, camera footage caught the whole incident, but it makes you wonder how many other people were not so lucky and got deported anyways. President Trump's new Expedited Removal policy has made making these types of shady arrests even easier. A policy that specifies if an undocumented person fails to prove 2-year residency to an ICE officer, not a judge, the defendants will face imprisonment and deportation. Since we can't even trust ICE to follow basic law enforcement procedure, I don't know how we're also supposed to expect them to adjudicate the law with fairness and concern for liberty. But anyways, let's continue.
And yet it's very popular in the Democratic Party. So far, this bill has 44 Democratic co-sponsors. On the screen is a list of some of their names. Some of these people you've heard of before: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. They're celebrities, but some are obscure. Earl Blumenauer, for example, has represented Oregon for decades. Before this, he's maybe been best known for running the Congressional Bicycle Caucus. And yet, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Blumenauer has decided to wreck the country. Now, we'd like to talk to Earl Blumenauer on this show. We'd like to hear why he supports this bill. We'd like to talk to any of the people who've co-sponsored it. We reached out to many of them today to come on and defend their views, but not one of them agreed to come. Why? Because they're cowards. And yet we think you ought to know what they're doing.
Okay, this next part should be obvious, but for the sake of argument, I'll spell it out. Agreeing to appear on Tucker Carlson's show would have been the worst thing any of those 44 co-sponsors could have done for their careers and for the success of this bill. You have to understand, Tucker doesn't invite the opposing side of an argument onto his show just to have a light chat. And even then, his program steers far away from providing its audience anything even resembling an informed conversation or a well-planned debate. Instead, he berates and insults his guests, twisting their words, asking leading questions. Feel free to look up his many interviews with leftist activists and politicians, and you'll see what I'm talking about. His mission seems to be not to have a discussion, but to try to make his enemies look as dumb as possible, regardless of the truth and without concern for how his lies affect our ability as a country to have a fair, reasonable discussion about politics. If anything, I'd consider Tucker to be a coward for using his platform not to lead an informed discussion, but to scapegoat the left as the cause of all our problems. Yeah, right.
Here's the bill's primary sponsor, Jesus Garcia of Illinois, after introducing the bill. Garcia said this.
This is not a radical project. We are simply asking for a fair shot and the opportunity for immigrants to stay in the country they call home. A New Way Forward does just that. It would end mandatory immigration detention, end the automatic pipeline to deportation through the criminal justice system. It would end deportation for people who have had contact with the criminal legal system. It would end the practices of local police engaging in immigration enforcement and the increased ever-policing of communities of color. It would decriminalize immigration.
This is not a radical project. Of course, the opposite is true. The bill is completely radical. It would transform America into a place you don't recognize.
Now, what do you think Carlson meant by a country you wouldn't recognize? His argument clearly points to criminality. He thinks all of these criminals are being sent back to the U.S. just to mess things up for everyone. Keep in mind, though, how many migrants now have a criminal record, despite never facing due process. All of them. Over 500,000 people. And yes, I'm sure some of them are criminals. But this little loophole in Carlson's logic should help illustrate why he would use language like a place you wouldn't recognize. Under the New Way Forward Act, criminals will still be convicted and deported, just not almost every migrant. And certainly not men like Juan Hernandez, who lived in America legally and were arrested anyway. With much fewer migrant convictions and deportations, and making illegal border crossing a civil rather than criminal offense, guess what's going to happen? More migrants are going to be allowed to stay in the U.S. And pairing this with the fact that the Hispanic population has made up 52% of population growth between 2008 and 2018, it should become clear what exactly Carlson means by a place you wouldn't recognize. Yep, sure wouldn't, would you, Tucker? Because there'd be a whole lot more brown faces walking around, huh? Associating Hispanics with criminality has never been very difficult for the right, despite the fact you're more likely to be harmed or sold drugs by a U.S. citizen than a non-citizen. Carlson doesn't see any of this, though, and his audience sure hates being called racist, even when their policies, like expedited removal, which have allowed for the racial profiling and deportation of not just undocumented migrants, but citizens and residents of our country, proceed without anybody caring. It's just embarrassing. I'm embarrassed for our country. We should be better than this, and we're not.